it. I see it now. Yeah.
Okay, inshallah, we're live now. Bismillah wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to the second edition of UNCAGED Lockdown. We are very, very privileged today to have Dr. Tarek Younis with us. He is a psychologist who lectures at Middlesex University with a great deal of experience within the Muslim community and other communities as well, looking at the ways in which Muslims are impacted by systems of structural racism and violence, as well as with a special focus, especially on the prevent strategy. So mashallah, Tarek has a great deal of expertise. And of course with us as well, my colleague and friend, Cerie Bullivant, who, subhanAllah, he's a survivor of the war on terror. He was under a control order for a couple of years until he was, alhamdulillah, exonerated. And he's going to share some of his experiences with us. So I'm your host, Asim Qureshi. I'm the research director of CAGE, and alhamdulillah, it's my privilege and honor to be able to host these two gentlemen today. So I'm going to start with a very, very simple question. How are you both doing? Tarek, why don't I start with you? Bismillah.
Yeah, alhamdulillah. Jazakallah khair, first of all, for inviting me. Barakallahu fikum for organizing this this sort of podcast as well. I'm doing good, alhamdulillah. I mean, I can't deny that there's been a lot of changes, but at the same time, we are recognizing to what extent we are either privileged or not through the pandemic. Alhamdulillah, I think in a lot of ways I've recognized all the privileges that I have, being able to work from home, not being concerned about rent or my apartment. All these things have really dawned on me. So alhamdulillah, I'm very grateful for that.
Alhamdulillah. And Kaleem, how are things, Akhi?
Yeah, alhamdulillah. In a lot of ways, it's been a little mini flashback to being on lockdown for 2 years during my control order. But now we're sharing it with the world. So yeah, it's an interesting one, but alhamdulillah, it's good. We've got to look at a lot of positives. Alhamdulillah, I'm spending more time with the children, and alhamdulillah with my family. And yeah, as the brother said, alhamdulillah, there's a lot to be grateful for as well. MashaAllah.
Okay, jazakallah khair.
We do go end up going slightly cabin crazy.
Slightly is an understatement. But yeah.
Alhamdulillah. Okay, so Tarek, I'm interested in something that you offered recently. You put out an offer to people who maybe just wanted to talk about how they were feeling, just kind of a free service that you did for, Jazakallah khair, for many of our community out there. I just wanted to get a gauge from you as to what is the reaction from different parts of our community, because obviously also we're so isolated, it's difficult to talk to people in the masjid. Right now we're mostly talking to close family and friends, staying in touch with them, but you're obviously now getting a wider opinion from others, so maybe you can tell us a little bit about that, inshallah.
Yeah, khair. I mean, when I put out that advert, actually it caught on worldwide. So I was getting people actually from all over, from Malaysia, from the States.
Okay.
And I think it just shows to what extent this is a global issue. In terms of the general feel of what people are going through, I mean, I think the type of people who might contact me, or not necessarily just the type of people who might contact me, but I think in general, what the pandemic is really revealing are issues that have already existed. People already had problems, let's say, with their spouses, problems, let's say, with uncertainty, with anxiety, fear of death, whatever it might be. So people already live with these things constantly. And as we know very well, when it comes to issues that might affect us, as some might say psychologically, it often comes at points of what you call boundary. So, something breaks your everyday habits. People are very good at protecting themselves from their fears using, whatever habits that they might do every day. And suddenly when you break those habits, a lot of things reveal themselves.
Right. No, okay, Jazakallah khair. I think that's quite interesting. Of course, this is such an exceptional time. Yeah, and perhaps in some ways not so exceptional as well. Kaleem, it's interesting that the American comedian Ellen, she commented that being in isolation was like being in prison. It did cause some controversy, her remarks, but I did think of you as soon as she said it, as somebody that I know personally who was held under a control order, which is for those who don't know, it's a form of house arrest that severely limits your movement, limits your ability to live a normal life, limits your access to certain facilities that we take for granted, really. So maybe you could tell us a little bit more about what life under a control order was like and how it's different, perhaps, or maybe similar to what we're facing now.
So I was speaking to one of the other people that's on a TPIM at the moment, and who's going.
Sorry, you have to explain what a TPIM is for people, brother.
So a TPIM is a terrorism prevention and investigation measure. So it's the current form of the control order. When David Cameron first came to power, they watered down the control order regime by creating these TPIM regimes. And currently, there are brothers and their families all over the country who have been under these measures, very similar to the ones that I was under, for around 3 years almost now. And they're on house arrest. They can't go out. They can't do anything. They're completely locked down. And so in speaking to them, one of the things that we kind of were joking about is that everybody's on a TPIM now. Everybody's on a control order now. This is something that's gone from affecting just a small number of the Muslim community, because it is only Muslims that get put on these things, to something that's now for the whole country. And the brother said to me, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And so the interesting thing about the similarities and differences, when I was on a control order, I couldn't go out and buy a pint of milk without calling the police and telling them I'm leaving the house to go and buy some milk. I had curfews, I had to stay indoors all of the time. I couldn't have people come and stay at my house. I couldn't go and stay at other people's houses. So in a lot of ways, those aspects are very, very similar, at least sort of on a surface level, with what we're going through now. The feeling of isolation, the loneliness that you get. One of the things that makes it very, very different is we all understand why this is happening now. There's a virus going around and we need to do social distancing. We need to keep our families, keep the NHS safe. And so the reason why we're doing this is because of that. When you're on a control order, when you're on a TPIM, the evidence against you is kept secret. So you're having this imposed down upon you by the government, but you don't know what the reason is, what you're even accused of, beyond the most vague terms of, in my case, a threat to British interests. I mean, what does that even mean? There was never any evidence given, never any open day in court. Even my lawyers didn't know what the evidence is. So that creates a very sort of different feeling in yourself when you're going through it, because you don't have the solidarity of the whole country going through this thing with you. In fact, you just have pure isolation, in the sense that you're the only one going through it, or a very small number of people going through it, and you don't even know why it's happening to you as well. And that not understanding the why of why it's happening is often a very hard aspect of it. I mean, Dr. Tarek can probably speak about that some more.
Yeah, actually, Tarek, I did want to bring you in at this point to ask you. I mean, of course, part of your work is not only to work with individuals, but also to study the way that suspect communities are treated. And it's also interesting for me that a lot of the language around the coronavirus that's coming from government speak is really around a securitization. So they talk about like a war on coronavirus, and it's very militarized language in many ways. So I'm just wondering if you had any thoughts about kind of your area of study and how that links to what we're facing right now.
Yeah, I mean, Khair, obviously, my heart first goes out to Brother Kaleem for everything he went through. Ellen, is definitely speaking from a position of privilege, right? And then that's something we have to recognize.
I don't know, bro. I was in Belmarsh, and it did feel like her multi-million-pound pad that I'm sure she's got in Las Vegas. I'm sure there's not much difference between a 3x3 cell and a talk show host.
Not by much. I think it's just the number of bathrooms, right?
Right.
Yeah, maybe.
It's probably just that.
The gallows humor, war and terror.
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot to be said, I think, about how Muslims as a whole, it's not just Muslims, I think people on the margins of society have already recognized that in many ways, they've lacked that ability to feel comfortable in many spaces, right? Especially when we're talking about Muslims, we know very well in research an emerging theme is this idea of affective surveillance, right? That Muslims, they feel like, well, they're being watched. They're being, their thoughts and behaviors, are constantly under scrutiny. And you could think about that when it comes to social distancing, et cetera. People have been mentioning online, they feel this extra level of like trepidation and anxiety when they're going around to others. And it just goes to show how, first of all, there's many communities that have been experiencing this for a long time. And, Ellen's point is just to show, she's sort of getting a glimpse of a different experience that she's not accustomed to, but that people on the margins of society are very well aware of. And I think that there's a lot to say also on the impact of how people, if we were going to talk about mental health and stuff like that, I mean, the impact is obviously very wide ranging on that front alone. I would say there's another element to this. And if we want to stay within the realm of like, the stress and anguish of like, oh, this suddenly feels like a prison. I think there's an element of this whereby I think people who have been especially privileged, I mean, we know people, especially racialized white males who are rich, they could do terrible things and get away with anything, right? And now all of a sudden, there's some element of control in their lives, right? Even if it's just the most basic, just the most sort of basic boundaries. And we can understand how that can be distressing because, we know that in modern society, we're sort of inculcated to feel like we can have control over everything. And those who are privileged feel like they truly have control over everything. Whereas those who are not privileged always feel like they're subordinated to other people's powers. And so we can already start thinking about that discrepancy or the difference of how people are experiencing the social distancing, depending on, where they were in society in the first place.
Do you think that's played a part in the fact that over the weekend and this weekend, the parks have been really, really busy, and people haven't necessarily been following the guidelines that much?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Kareem, picking up on those points, I mean, we do see people like Nigel Farage and others kind of pushing back against this kind of, what they're claiming to be this authoritarianism strand that's coming through. Like, what are your thoughts about it? Because for me, it's like, I'm sitting back and I'm watching these guys talk about all this stuff. I'm just like, hold on a second. They kind of sound a little bit like us about the war on terror, I mean, do you see that yourself?
Well, the irony is that no one cared about growing state powers, introduction of secret evidence in civil and criminal cases, and this authoritarianism until it started knocking on their door. Until the effects started happening to them, there was no panic, there was no concern, and constantly in this line of work, especially, you're always reminded with the work that Cage does of the poem, of which there are many, many versions, but that came out during the run up to the Holocaust about they came for the communists and I did nothing because I wasn't a communist. They came for the trade unionists and I did nothing because I wasn't a trade unionist. And then sort of at the end of that, they say, and when they came for me, there was no one left to do anything. And that's very much how this tends to work. Muslims have been, and Cage has been saying explicitly for many years that Muslims are the canary in the mine for the powers that will end up spreading and spreading and spreading and having a wider and wider effect on society. And now that this is starting to affect other people, they're like, oh, wow, what? There are these things that might be slightly disproportionate.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, by the way, actually, I just want to take a break for this, just to say, we do have a comments section on the Facebook Live. So I do encourage our viewers to please, leave comments, leave questions. Inshallah, we'll try and read out as many as we can, get our two guests to respond to as many questions as we possibly can. So please do leave some questions for us, and we'll definitely endeavor to answer as many of them as we can possibly get to. I mean, Tarek, people are feeling a great deal of anxiety, right? And there's a lot of talk about mental health. And one of the points that you've made to me before is that if we focus on just mental health alone, what we do is we ignore like a larger picture. Can you explain that more for our views today in terms of what you mean by kind of a larger infrastructure?
Yeah, for sure. So it's important to know, I think, just following on with Karim, I think Karim really hit the nail on the head. I think just in terms of people experiencing in this world, having to experience things for themselves, and there's a guy, his name is Bauman. He talks about modernity, and he talks about how society is no longer based, it's no longer a community, it's a network, right? So the way society is today is a network of individuals rather than actual community. And what we're seeing, right now in terms of the impact of this pandemic or anything else, if we just even talk about austerity policies, for the last decade or so, we see that in many ways, the death toll and everything that's just, all the atrocities that are happening, they reveal the cracks in society. They reveal the cracks in how the state has been functioning in terms of its policies. And in a way, mental health is really great at jumping in and, and like, oh, well, if someone through whatever various measures of austerity policies, or let's say the pandemic, are feeling unwell, well, rather than actually filling in those cracks, we want them to feel better about themselves, right? And in a way, the psi disciplines, so anything that's sort of psychology related, it's well known that it's had that function for a very long time, or at least it has that ability to function in such a way. So if you want to even think about it in terms of a metaphor of just a child being beaten by a bully on the street, it's very convenient to just focus on the child's distress. And it's like, oh, that child needs mental health services, right? And then leave the bully alone. So the bully, nothing really happens to them, right? And you could think here, obviously, in terms of how, I think for me, this is what I call psychologization, and other people have spoken about this. It's really important to recognize, I think, if we're talking about the stress of COVID-19, or distress associated with COVID-19, I think, first of all, we got to think about, well, what's the meaning of COVID-19? What's the sort of meanings we could derive from it? And from there, to avoid psychologization, we start with structural meanings. We start with the fact that, oh, through austerity policies, in fact, the NHS has been gutted completely, right? And we know that for a fact. It's not something people can argue. And I think there's something to be said there that's really, really important. I think I'm very happy to see a lot of people come in, such as myself, providing mental health services, etc. But there should be as much, if not as even more, pressure to fill in those cracks, which have brought people to a distressful situation in the first place. And there's other structural issues we can bring out to that as well. But I think it's just important to emphasize that, we don't want to necessarily psychologize it all. The NHS staff that are working on the front line, they're being overworked. They're not protected. They're going through all these issues, all this stress, and they've been going through stress for a long time. It's really important to mention that this pandemic didn't start the stress of the NHS. The people in the NHS have been stressed for a very long time, and that was part of my research. And that's all due to the political economy of this country. And I think it's really, really important to emphasize that, yes, let's provide that support, but it can't be a bandage to a wound that keeps on bleeding.
Right, absolutely. Actually, I want to piggyback off something that you said, Tarek, for Kaleem, which is, you talked about communities versus networks. And, there have been so many feel-good stories amid the high death toll, right? And, it's a very, very bizarre media reporting cycle, actually, because usually the media is like, it concentrates so much on the doom and gloom of all of this stuff. But actually, there's been a surprising curve of very upbeat articles about the reaction response to COVID-19. And of course, I think we should celebrate that in some ways, in some small ways, in a somber way, considering the large number of people that are dying, unfortunately. But there is this idea that communities are now coming together. They're helping, where people are on WhatsApp groups, asking, do you need milk? Do you need whatever, right? In this time of difficulty. But Kaleem, did you feel any of that when you were going through what you were going through? Because is it only the case where people are at risk in the same way as everyone else that they feel like they can bring about some kind of solidarity? Or was there something different at play when you were being held in the way that you were? What did community look like for you then, as opposed to the way that we're understanding it now?
I mean, one of the hardest things of the whole aspects of going through the control order and being under isolation for 2 years and spending 6 months in prison was the fact that the people that I had been close with outside, my brothers in Dean, it bears also bearing in mind that when you become Muslim, you give up a lot, and a lot of people that would have been there to be with you through these things, who no longer want to do that because of the choices that you've made to become Muslim. Right. And so for reverts, especially your Muslim family, the wider community, they are often a much bigger part of your life. And unfortunately, when I was in prison, there was one visit from two blood brothers who came to visit me, and that was it from the Muslim community. When I was on my control order for 2 years in isolation, virtually everybody that I knew, and I'd been active in Dawah, active in the community, active in my local masjid, and nobody wanted anything to do with me. Anybody who found out about what I was going through refused to have any contact with me. And when I eventually couldn't take the control order anymore, and I went on the run, my local mosque, the place that knew me very, very well, that I prayed there since my first Jummah Salah, put up a wanted poster for me inside of the mosque. And when one brother took it down and said, look, we know Kaleem, everybody here knows him, this isn't right, this is not him, they went to the police and got another one to replace it. And that sort of, we speak so much in our community and in our deen and in our faith and religion about brotherhood and supporting one another and standing together. And yet often when there's a real stakes to that, it doesn't necessarily come through. And it's one of the stark differences to what I'm noticing now. MashaAllah, it's good. People are backing each other up. People are supporting each other. People are calling one another. But a lot of the time that just doesn't happen. And especially, even if you haven't been, if you're just accused of something to do with terrorism, if you're just, if there's just an accusation against you, then that can be all it takes for you, for your family, even if the husband is in prison, for the wife and children to be completely isolated and left alone. And that's why organizations like Cage and the people that support Cage and Hugs as well, helping households under great stress, is so important, because it comes through for those families and for those people at a time when no one else is doing it.
If you don't, I know this is really difficult for you to speak about, and Jazakallah khair for sharing that. If I can just stay with you for a moment, because, you know, I think what people don't understand about your case in particular is that in your mother, Allah yarhamuha, who wasn't Muslim at the time that you were under the control order, she was pretty much subject to the same conditions that you were, even though she wasn't you know, facing the same scrutiny or allegations or anything. It was just because she lived in the same house as you, right? Could you tell us a little bit about the impact that it had on her as well? Because she was obviously the person who was experiencing this alongside you most out of any.
Well, firstly, just having the police able to barge into the house anytime they pleased and do searches, sometimes 2 or 3 times a week, no warrant, no reasonable reason to do it, and just living with all of that equipment, surveillance equipment in the house as well. You've got this black box phone, which only calls the police station, and it can ring at any moment to check that you're on the premises. And just having that physical representation of the state authority in your house, that this has been placed there and it has to be kept in and plugged on and ready so that you can be checked up upon at any moment. And it would sometimes in the middle of the night, whenever they felt like it. And my mum was hugely strong to stand by me. And she, like, may Allah accept it from her and reward it. She never doubted me for a second, alhamdulillah. And you know, that kind of unconditional trust and respect, because you know a person and you know who they truly are, you would hope that would come from your brothers and sisters in Islam as well. But really, it was only a mother's love that brought that out. I've noticed, sorry, in the questions, somebody asked which mosque it was. I've got a lot of respect for that masjid, even though they made some mistakes, and I don't want to name and shame the mosque, but because generally they are, it's a beautiful place and a beautiful community, and I still love a lot of the people everybody that's there. And we all make mistakes, and it hurts when it happens, but yeah. So I did read the question, but I'm not trying to sort of thing. I just be clear.
May Allah guide us all to what is best, inshallah.
I mean,
yeah, I really appreciate you sharing that. I know how difficult it is for anybody to bring up the account of something difficult that happened to them in the past. So you know, we genuinely appreciate you sharing this with us.
While you brought her up, it's 2 days now since, or 8 years and 2 days since my mother took her shahada and became Muslim and passed away. So anyone who's watching, please make dua for her, inshallah.
Allah yarhamuha. Allah yarhamuha. Ameen. Jazakallah khair. Tarek, we've had some questions come through, and I think this one's a particularly interesting one that maybe actually both of you can probably respond to. Brother Khalid Rahman, he said, I recently learnt about framing and interpretation. Is that something we should work on in conversations, especially with the media? I mean, you know, I think that there is a lot to unpack here. in terms of framing of how COVID's been framed, about how we've been discussing everything from start to end, right? Even as a matter of theology, right? This has implications for us. So for us, this isn't just about survival. The way that, like anything else in life, the way that we react and respond to this, glaring test that's been put in front of not just us, but in front of the whole of society, I think that has implications in terms of even the way that we frame ourselves as Muslims who live amongst other communities here in the UK, and how we interpret what this means. So perhaps you can both comment on that, inshallah.
I'll let Tarek go first, inshallah.
I was going to throw the ball to you.
I got there first.
So you did. So I think we should always be mindful of how things are framed. In terms of interpretation, I'm not so sure exactly what to do with that. But in terms of framing, I mean, this has always been the most important thing in terms of how Muslims are framed, how this virus is framed. This virus is framed, for example, as a natural disaster, when in fact there's a lot of the deaths and things that are happening, all around. They're all quite man-made. I mean, that's one of the elements of modernity that's really important to understand, is that when people are dying all over, I mean, even through climate change or things like that, there's a human element involved in this. And so I think one of the framings one of the ways we need to be mindful of framing is to look back at, who's speaking, and, given that they're in positions of power, what benefit they have in terms of what they're saying. And to always fall back, I think, on a rigorous knowledge base. I mean, it's not only about Muslims. I think there's a lot that's been written about these things all across the board. And there's a lot of solidarity. And I think we have to be able to tap into this, because the framing is really quite obvious. It's quite obvious when Boris Johnson is the one that the cameras are pointing at, when he goes out and he's clapping, when, a large portion of largely, it seems, ethnic minority individuals are passing away, especially among healthcare staff. There's something to be said about how these issues are framed. And I would agree with the questioner. For sure, it's important to be mindful of it. But again, this is nothing new to COVID-19. The framing of good Muslim, bad Muslim, is quite evident in the media as well. There's other framings that are very important to keep in mind.
Kerry?
One of the things that I found interesting about the way that all of this has been framed is very much we're on a war footing. And obviously, especially with the work that I've been doing now with Cage for these years, my ears always prick up whenever anyone says that it's any sort of war, and I ask myself, what does that necessitate, and what does it mean? And in this case, we've got a war on the virus, and we've got a war on terror, and we've got physical wars going on abroad as well at the moment, and
yeah,
these framings that are used often allow then anything to be a byproduct of that. And so a lot of the things that we're being asked to do in terms of social distancing and stuff, they are important and necessary things, and they're good. And we do need that quote unquote blitz spirit. But it's interesting how the imagery of war is used in evocative and powerful ways constantly whenever the state needs it.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
I don't know if you guys have seen the tweet by the US ambassador to the UK talking about a phone call that he's had with Peter Ruddock, the CEO of Lockheed Martin, which is a private security company. What does he say? He says the call he had is to hear about their contribution to the UK's fight against COVID-19. Members of their team are signing up for defense HQ reserves. So it's interesting that, like, you know, private security companies are the go-to organizations for people who are in power, for, you know, kind of representatives of the state, that, you know, immediately, as you've said yourself, Khalil, there is this kind of, we see the imagery of war, the framing of war being used, being evoked almost immediately. And so I think that's important, because I think also as a society, and of course this topic today is really about what we're talking about. We're talking about, you know, how we're all responding to this at a spiritual, emotional, psychological level, right? That's what we want to talk about. But surely, and Tarek, maybe you could respond to this, surely our response is so much based on what we're receiving back, the way that this is being pitched. And so what does that do to you in terms of, you know, kind of being in this isolation? A lot of people, they're by themselves. You know, people like myself, I'm very lucky that I have my wife and children around me. Not everybody has that, though. I've seen people tweeting saying, I literally have no one, you know, that I can speak to, or have, you know, human physical contact with. So what does it do for them to be seeing this messaging?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. I think it's just important to emphasize that I think even though we're all social distancing ourselves, I think on a sort of experiential level or just on a personal level, people are going through that very differently. You know, you can't just really compare a single mother with children, you know, to potentially someone a father who's about to lose his job or already lost his job. We know that 1 in 10 people in the United States in the last few weeks lost their jobs. It's a humongous number. I think 17 million people lost their jobs. Mm-hmm. You know, people with underlying health conditions. So again, I think there's a lot about what COVID-19 is revealing in terms of the structures and the cracks in society. And it's really important to emphasize that, because you know, we can make a blanket statement about mental health and like we're all socially isolated because we all have that particular condition, but that's taking a very narrow vertical slice of people's lives, right? And I think anyone who's ever gone to therapy with me or whatever, you know, like I often use the metaphor of books when we're talking about people's lives. You know, just because we're all whatever page we're on in our books right now, we have COVID-19, you know, on that page. You know, that's just, you know, I might be on page 5,738. Someone might be on page 4,068, you know, and like our lives are completely different, you know, and COVID-19 is just going to be a different factor to this. But I think then also when it comes to social isolation, so let's pretend we hold things equal. And I might be really overlooking your question right now in terms of the war framing. You know, I guess I can't say much in terms of the war framing. I think the war framing belongs to the larger military-industrial complex, right? I mean, without a doubt, if I'm gonna make a point that's very tangential, and then maybe come back and bring it back to like the
it's
anguish,
fine. Take it any way you like.
Suffering, suffering and loneliness. So let's look just structurally. We need to know. I'm gonna just say something that I feel like has been sort of on my chest for a long time. I think a lot of people have somehow this dream or hope that COVID-19 is going to bring society together, you know, that the world is going to become a better place afterwards. But that's not at all how things operate. That's not all how society operates. It's not how things are structured. You know, the major industries, we see Amazon and all these other companies, you know, they're making a lot more money off these crises. And one of the biggest, you know, industries in the world is security industries. We already know, like Israel, for example, is using counterterrorism technologies to be able to track, for the sake of COVID-19, you know, where people are going, who's meeting with who, et cetera, right? So in fact, we're going to probably see the exact opposite.
Sorry, 1 second. I mean, because somebody actually questioned this. They're saying, but this is an exceptional moment. Isn't this the appropriate response?
Surveillance?
Well, because I mean, this is a completely unprecedented, this is what the question is asking. This is a completely unprecedented time, right? Like surely, like not surveillance for everything, but, you know, we need stricter measures. We need, you know, harsher laws. We need stronger laws right now for this particular issue. So I'm just gonna because the question was asked, so I'm using their voice to question what you're saying here.
Okay, let's bookmark the whole thing about suffering and anguish and loneliness, because I think we probably have to get to that. So I find that's a question that comes up really often, right? I mean, it comes up with anything, and it brings up to the point whereby we feel like the only options we have are that. I think that's where I can give legitimacy to the question, to the questioner. I feel like it seems like that's the case. It seems like all the options, you know, come down to like, oh, how do we stop terrorism? We need to be able to read everyone's emails, everyone's messages, right? You know, the predominant response to a risk-based society, which is what we live in, is always to be able to provide more surveillance and to be able to manage more thoughts and behaviors of the population. And we've gotten very, very good at this. And because of that, it seems like that's really the only option available, rather than potentially thinking through what exactly that entails, especially, let's say, for Muslims, non-Muslims, et cetera. Like, let's say, fine, if that seems like it's a worthy option to consider, right? But who's doing it? Is there any form of regulations involved? You know, is there any oversight, transparency? You'll find usually, I mean, I think also you probably know better than me, but the answer is unequivocally no, right? We know that Facebook, I mean, we're on Facebook right now. You know, the book Age of Surveillance Capitalism laid out very, very, very clearly, black on white, that, you know, we're headed towards a future whereby all the major companies want us to think this way, and there's absolutely no way to stop them, you know, in terms of collecting our information, in terms of increased surveillance, et cetera. So I think we have to drastically rethink a lot of things. But in terms of the foundation is, how is it that we've come to experience the world that surveillance appears to be the only option? That's a very, very important point of reflexivity that we need to have as a society.
Seeing articles on the BBC today about Google providing data on how many people are visiting parks on the weekend.
Yeah.
There's a part of you is like, is no one stopping to question, like, should Google have that much information about exactly who's in what parks when? And like, is there an overreach here?
But doesn't this whole conversation come back to this idea that you've been mentioning, Tarek, about, you know, how society is structured, right? So the fundamental premise, if you begin from the premise that human beings are incapable of doing the right thing, and therefore the state has to militarize itself against its own population, then of course the inevitable conclusion is that you need more militarization, you need more securitization. Whereas no one questions a fundamental premise, which is a very, very negative view. I remember Dalal Asad talks about this in his book, Secular Translations, where he says is that effectively, because the state, you know, took the role of God in public life, right? The state said to, you know, in secularism, the state says, you know, I am the ultimate arbiter of all morality. The notion that a human being could act based on an ethic that is linked to something greater, that's linked to something more divine, is now gone. And therefore the state assumes that it has to militarize itself in order to maintain public morality, in order to maintain public ethics, which is where the very notion of like, we mistrust you comes from. Therefore we need stronger laws, we need stronger measures. And so I guess we circle back to this idea of, well, we need to fundamentally rethink as a society, you know, who we are and what our ethics are and how we interact and engage with one another. That this whole idea of like the state being all powerful, and the state being the sole arbiter of, you know, how we take care of one another, that needs to change fundamentally at a very structural level. I just want to move, if you guys don't mind, move this conversation, because we've got about maximum 15 minutes left, and we've got a couple of other questions that have come through, but I want to start moving this conversation.
Sort of a very good question from Orphan Child, which about the Muslim problem,
Sure.
been parked now. What's your take on that, Asim?
I haven't seen it. Sorry, I'll have to have a look.
I'll read it to you.
Yeah,
It
sure.
has the Muslim problem categorically been parked now, especially as the first 4 doctors that died, Shaheed inshallah, in the UK, Muslim, i.e. Islam has saved many Brits. Got my own thoughts to that, but do you think the Muslim problem has been parked?
No. I mean, you guys are the guests today. I'm very, very interested to hear what both of you have to say about it. So why don't you guys take that question on? And then I want to move into like talking about, okay, how do we, from a not necessarily solution-based perspective, but like thinking a bit more about, okay, how can we help one another moving forward, inshallah?
So in answer to that question, it's a very, very good question. The war on terror, especially since 2001, it's had many, many ebbs and flows in the speed at which legislation has been put in, how harsh that legislation is. And sometimes for 6 months, for a year, even a little bit longer, you'll find, as you put it so eloquently, the Muslim problem gets put on the back burner for a while. But what we never ever see is a rollback of the previous legislation and a stepping back of the power they've already taken. It's just, we've taken this and then we're going to wait here and we're going to consolidate for a while. We're going to let that settle in. And then the next thing is going to happen and we're going to take more and more and more. And so the march is only ever in one direction, even if the media attention on Muslims does occasionally oscillate with what's going on in the times. Awesome.
Yeah.
Tarek.
I was just going to say, just add very quickly that, just piggybacking on what you're saying. I mean, I think it's really important that people who are listening maybe understand the concept of respectability politics. And that's the idea that, if we present ourselves in the best possible way or in the best possible form, if we sacrifice our bodies and our wealth for the state, there's brothers and sisters talking about literally donating to the NHS. And while I might respect the spirit and the intention behind it, it lends itself to this larger question of, the very fact that the questioner is asking that, it shows that this whole good Muslim, bad Muslim narrative is very much still alive, right? And we know very well that if people we have these heroes, and it's not only about Muslims, even in the Black communities in the United States and other places where certain communities are marginalized. There's always this hope that, suddenly there's a bunch of heroes that show up, or a bunch of good people. That doesn't break the good Muslim, bad Muslim narrative. It just reinforces it, right? Yeah. Now people are going to be like, look, those are the good Muslims because they sacrificed their lives for the state. And there's still bad Muslims out there that have to be caught. So in fact, it's not that it's been parked. It's the frame itself. You see, certain issues belong to the very frame of how Muslims are racialized, how they're seen.
Well, there was an interesting example of that I saw going around. May Allah accept, a Muslim nurse passed away while she was working on the coronavirus, and there were a lot of positive articles about her. But instead of using all of her recent photos where she'd started wearing hijab, they all went to her older photos from social media from before she wore hijab and used those on their pictures and their covers and their stories. And that's part of the interesting way that Muslims can be looked at, still always through this securitized lens.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And may Allah accept the sister. And
Ameen,
Ya Rab. Absolutely.
Alhamdulillah.
Absolutely.
So, using the last few minutes that we have, inshallah, I really want our viewers to take something away in terms of, strategies, things that they can think about, reflect on, in order to kind of meet the challenge of this time as best as they can. So, Kaleem, why don't I start back with you first, in terms of your experience? What would the, I guess, strategies that you use to assist? I'm not saying that necessarily a cure, because obviously we our hearts are constantly changing. We go through ups and downs all the time, and I think it's important that people understand that and acknowledge that there isn't a pill that you can take to you know, kind of cure everything in life. You know, like everything else, there is a process. So Khalid, maybe you can share some of your processes, the things that may have helped you at different times of your own experience.
Well, I mean, certainly having been on like house arrest for 2 years, and when you have to try and find some sort of routine to get you through what you're doing. And even if that's the smallest things, like I'm going to make sure I take a walk every day, or even some days it comes down to just like making sure that you actually get dressed. You know, you don't have to go out and you're not doing anything. Duvet days and pajama days, which were a treat once upon a time, can become a spiral on another occasion. But finding that routine, this will have been said by people far, far wiser than me and far, far better equipped to speak about it, turn to the Quran as well. Before I was even had anything happen to me, I went to a talk from Wazam. At that time, I didn't have the pleasure of knowing him like I do now, alhamdulillah. So I was just there in the thing, and he spoke about the fact of the connection that he got with Surah Al-Yusuf, especially when he was reading it in prison. And, you know, mashallah, one of the beautiful things about the Quran is if you read it and you reflect on it, and especially if you read, and there were certain verses and certain parts of the Quran that were very, very powerful to me when I was going through what I was going through, particularly Surah Yusuf and the ayats and the parts of the Quran about the people of the cave, which bring a whole nother level of meaning to it when you take time to stop and ponder and think about what those verses are talking about and what they mean, and the sabr that people before you have had, and put your reliance upon Allah. I know it sounds slightly cliched, but it really, really is important to draw solace from Allah and Allah's words.
Tarek?
Yeah, khair, inshallah. I guess to really, I think now we're addressing the title of this podcast, right? I think
it only took us an hour.
Yeah, I was about to say we'll have the sequel. So I think there's a lot to be said about what negative experiences reveal to us about ourselves, our souls, right? I think that's the most important thing. Brothers and sisters, I think just in general who are listening, let me first of all preface this before I forget. You know, if anyone's listening and they feel like they have someone to speak with, they need someone to speak with rather. You know, you can find a way to get in contact with me either right now here through Facebook or whatever, or if you know of anyone else. I've been giving just 1 hour a day to anyone who's going through COVID-19 related issues. So I think one of the things that's really important to know is that in Islam, but also there's many sort of secular ways of looking at this, that, you know, the stress or anguish that you're experiencing in isolation, this is a meaningful process. You know, it's not, I would recommend to anyone who is in distress, you know, the thing that we don't want to do is to numb ourselves away from it, you know, to try to run away from it, to try to, you know, overcome it. And there's a lot of easy ways to do so. And I think in fact, I think a lot of society does push us to try to almost self-medicate our way out of experience of distress that we have. But rather, I would encourage all the brothers and sisters to think about this, you know, if you even want to take from existential, if anyone here has a background in psychology, to think about it from a psychodynamic or other perspectives, that every experience of distress that we go through is meaningful. It reveals something profound. From a secular perspective, it could be just about yourself, but from an Islamic perspective, it could be about yourself and your relationship to Allah. And I think, you know, if I were to just draw an example, and maybe I can end on this sort of example, you know, I think, subhanAllah, in the plus or minus 10 years that I've been giving therapy and speaking with brothers and sisters, you know, we don't talk about this in the Muslim community, but there's a lot of brothers and sisters that have a fear of death. It's not a subject that is broached actually very often. I don't know if it's just somehow assumed that people shouldn't, but the fear of death is actually quite, you know, it belongs to a fear that's sort of found within wider society as well. So it's not surprising. And what death symbolizes, I think, for many people is this total lack of control. Because remember, one of the things that we're sort of grown, or, you know, some of the things that we develop with, or we grow with, is to feel like we can have control over everything, that cause and effect is in our hands. And so this isolation, you know, for a lot of people, they're isolated. And one of the, you know, for some brothers and sisters I've been speaking with, one of the reasons why that's such an experience of anguish is because, you know, they're forced to be dependent on something outside of their own control. You know, they've developed, for many reasons, a life of self-reliance, and they hate restraint. So this just the experience of restraint itself, it doesn't have to be just related to COVID-19. It just could be the experience of restraint. Is very distressing. And in that, you know, they could technically just break the rules. They could do whatever they want, right? But it does provide a moment of reflection, if they could, to take a moment and think, oh, you know, what does this reveal about my relationship to Allah? Is cause and effect really in my hands? Or have I always been dependent on Allah, for example? You know, is Allah the one who's always in His Majesty, the one who's control of all things? And this experience of anguish is revealing to me how I've always needed to be in control. And there's a lot of nuance to this, but it's just to explain with an example of why we have to think about our distress as something that is meaningful. And that is something that one can always, you know, explore and think about, well, what does this reveal about myself, my relationship with others, and my relationship with Allah?
Jazakallah khairan.
I'm done.
Yeah. No, barakallah feek. That's an excellent point, or series of points. I liked you both. Kaleem, I think, you know, you very strongly recommended like reading the Quran. But Tarek, you mentioned before the start, when we were discussing what we were going to talk about today, a specific book. Could you tell us a bit more about that book, as one of the books that, you know, I've having read it myself, I would highly recommend as well?
Actually, this book, so, you know, actually I've been giving therapy to probably more non-Muslims than Muslims in general. And if there's any non-Muslims listening, or, you know, I think Muslims as well could very much appreciate this book. It's called Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. And Viktor Frankl was someone who really, a long time ago, to go down. His book, actually, he wrote it very shortly after having left the concentration camps. And, you know, he wrote about his experiences. And I think one of the things that sort of also brings it back to what Kaleem was also mentioning, you know, Viktor Frankl noticed that, oh, you know, they're almost, I mean, to draw a very, very superficial similarity, you know, if you think about concentration camp as being things out of your control, COVID-19, things being out of your control, you know, there's experiences that you're going through, and those who are simply just suffocating. And I think why I find this book so profound is that it really just highlights the importance for us to give meaning to the experiences that we're going through. why is it that we feel the way we do? And I can really just recommend this book to everyone. I used to give it out to people. So I used to always have several copies, but it's because it's such a short book you can read within a few days usually.
Right.
So if anyone is interested beyond the Quran, so Surah Yusuf, I think is probably the best recourse right now for many brothers and sisters. But if anyone wants just a very good book to read to help us reflect on, you know, the meaningfulness of suffering, I can recommend Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning.
Yeah, definitely. Jazakallah khairan. I mean, as I was saying to you before, Viktor Frankl's book is one of the few times that I've read a book by a non-Muslim and it's increased my own iman in Allah. Like it's such a profound and beautiful series of reflections in, you know, some of the most horrific circumstances you can possibly find yourself. So, you know, we've been going on for an hour and I've already taken up a lot of time of my my two guests. Jazakumullah khair to them both for sharing their amazing reflections. You know, inshallah, hopefully this discussion is something that will be of benefit to many of our viewers and even those who may view this after the fact, inshallah. I'm sorry that we weren't able to get to every single question directly, but, you know, the brothers are, you know, they're online. You can try and find them maybe if you've got something very, very pressing, but really, you know, Jazakumullah khair to them for giving us their time, sharing their insights. And inshallah, hopefully we will have more programming for you all, especially leading up to Ramadan and also in Ramadan itself. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam.